Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll give folks some time to enter our class today. Wanted to thank you folks who are here already for participating in Wild Farm Alliance's course about birds on farms. Wild Farm Alliance's mission is to promote healthy and viable agriculture that helps to protect and restore wild nature. And this virtual course is intended to teach agricultural professionals and farmers how to support beneficial birds and manage pest birds on their farms. We're going to cover some general Zoom guidelines. I'm sure folks have already participated in a Zoom session or two, but just a reminder that you should all be muted during this process. We will have some interactive scenarios today. We'll actually be entering breakout sessions and other exciting opportunities for you to participate today. We will have some polls. So currently there should be a poll showing on your screen. If you don't see that poll, it could either be that you're using an outdated version of Zoom or that it just got minimized. So on your Zoom toolbar there, you should see a little icon with graphs that says polls next to your chat icon. If you have any issues today or need some technical assistance, please enter that information into the chat, and myself and Shelly will be able to help you with that. And as well, ask those questions in the chat. A reminder as well that today was approved by both Oregon and Washington for folks who are interested in participating for continued education credits for their applicators licenses. So let me know either in the chat or send me an email, because it's required to participate in all pools today, as well as passing a quiz that we're going to give to you afterwards. And that is for 1 credit for both participants in Oregon and Washington. So today you're here to learn about Farmscape and landscape features for birds on farms. And I just want to remind you that this is part of a 10-lesson course, right? So our next lessons will be wrapping up in July on seeing the land through the eyes of birds, and then bring it all together with prioritizing all this information that we've gained to see what we can do to help birds the most on our farms. So here's the agenda today. I guess I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Brian Fagundis, and I'm the program coordinator for Wild Farm Alliance. And I'm also a wildlife biologist, and I'm excited that you're all here today. So first, we're gonna hear from Megan, and she's gonna present some amazing information from work she's done across the United States. Then Danny Karp with UC Davis will then be presenting afterwards. And then we'll have this opportunity after you participate in these breakout rooms to also come back and share some of your information and have these farm discussions. And then we'll wrap it all up at the end. And I want to remind you that those polls that are showing up on your screen, those aren't graded. So this first one, right, is just general information. But the one at the end of today, we'll have some other questions pertaining to the information we covered today. That information is used so that we can report back to our sponsors and funders for this program. And so without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Megan and take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to be talking with you all today. My name is Megan Garfinkel, and I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So right now, and for the past 5 years or so, I've been based in the Midwest of the United States. I've been studying agricultural areas out here. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the farmland vegetation features that can affect pest control services that are provided by birds. I know that there have been some previous courses in this series that have focused on the control of non-insect pests like rodents by birds like hawks and owls. My focus today, though, is going to be more on insectivorous birds and the ways that they can provide pest control services by eating insect pests. All right, so we're going to start really basic. We all know, of course, that birds consume a huge amount of insects. And in fact, this was a study that estimated 400 to 500 million tons of prey, insect prey, are eaten by insectivorous birds every year. We also know that most songbirds are actually going to consume insects at least sometime during their life. So we know, of course, that this can be a really valuable service in agriculture, birds providing this pest control service by eating insect pests. And you've probably seen some version of a slide like this before. Basically, what this is showing is studies that have taken place in different types of agriculture across the world that have shown that birds are able to provide significant pest control services that are measurable either in terms of increasing crop yield or decreasing the amount of damage to the crops by pests. So today, I'm going to be mainly focusing on temperate agriculture. So I'm not going to be really talking about these studies that have taken place on coffee farms, for instance. What I'd like to do is focus on some of these studies, including some of the work that I've done myself, as well as other researchers, that can help to sort of show what some of the broad patterns are in these pest control services that we see by birds. All right. So one really important variable, of course, that can affect pest control by birds on farms is the vegetation both within farms and also around the farms. So my focus today is going to be to discuss the ways that researchers have found that this vegetation can affect patterns of bird use of the farms, and then how that also can affect the probability of seeing pest control services on those farms. And then in particular, I'm going to be talking about landscape features or vegetation that's within the farm, and then also vegetation that's surrounding the farm separately. So this is just a Google map image of a little bit of a sad area, but this is out in Illinois near me. You can see it's a very agricultural area. And in this map, we can see both these within farm and sort of surrounding the farm vegetation features that I'm going to be discussing. So here we've got this tree line or hedgerow, which is going through some of the fields and along the edges of other fields. And then we also have these larger patches of natural habitat in the landscape that are surrounding the farm or nearby those farm. And generally, an individual farmer is going to have a little less control over how those larger patches of natural habitat are managed, but they can still have a big impact on the pest control services that you see on farms. So I'm going to start by talking about some vegetation management within the farm and the ways that it can be used to affect pest control by birds. I'm specifically going to give examples from some studies that have looked at crop selection, intercropping, and then also studies that have looked at the field margins or hedgerows. And when I say field margins, I'm just talking about what's growing along the edge of the cropped fields. So on a bunch of these future slides, you'll see I've got at the very bottom this citation to a study. You don't really need to pay attention to that, but if you're interested in learning more about some of these studies, I can give anyone information afterwards, either link them to this, this paper or discuss the information with them. So on the slides, I'll have at the very bottom this citation of the study and then a little bit of an excerpt from what they found. So I'm just going to start with a study that looked at row crop farms in Florida. And what they were studying was patterns of bird use of farm fields that were growing a single crop, like in this top picture here, versus farm fields that were growing multiple crops within a single field. And so what they found, if we look at these graphs here, is that if we specifically focus on these striped bars, this is showing us the number of species of birds that were actually in the crop fields. And we can see that there were more species of birds that were in the mixed crop fields rather than the monocrop fields. So we should note that, of course, more species of birds in the crop field doesn't necessarily equate always to higher pest control, but the two are often correlated with each other. And one of the reasons for that is when you have more species of birds, you've got birds that are foraging in a variety of different ways. So for instance, you might have swallows or other aerial insectivores that are going to be catching the insects that are flying through the air. And then you might have some of the birds that spend more time closer to the ground that are actually picking the insects off the leaves. And so when you have these more species, you generally see that's going to allow you to have often more pest control services. So another example of this comes from a study in the Midwest where they were comparing the bird use of fields that were growing monocrops to perennial polyculture fields. So these perennial polyculture fields were growing a variety of trees for fruits and nuts and things like that. And so again, they found a similar pattern. What we're looking at here is these control monocrop farms, fields, generally had lower bird biodiversity. So Shannon diversity is just an index of the amount of diversity of birds you have on the farm. So again, we saw lower bird biodiversity using these fields that grew a single crop versus these farms that were growing a mixture of different perennial crops. So, all right, we see that farms that are growing a mixture of crops tend to have more species of birds or more individual birds. Looking at it from a slightly different way, this was a study that looked at farms that were using intercropping to increase the diversity of plant life within a field. So what they did was they had vegetable fields, and for some of them, they were looking at fields that had intercropped rows of sunflowers, either one or two rows that went through the field. So the data that we're looking at here, these graphs are showing over here just 2 years of data, but basically they found more insect foraging birds were making use of these intercropped sunflower fields than birds in the control fields without the sunflowers. And similarly, they also found that the amount of time that these insectivorous birds spent foraging in the sunflower intercropped fields was higher than in the fields without those intercropped sunflowers. So on these farms, likely adding the intercropped sunflower to the vegetable crops was an effective way, probably, of increasing pest control services. So moving on to the field margins, hedgerows are probably the most well-known types of natural field margins that are surrounding agricultural fields. People often talk about hedgerows, but there's really a variety of ways that vegetation along the edges of a farm field can be managed. And so basically any way that vegetation can grow, you can have that along the edge of the farm field. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to try a little bit of just getting you guys talking to each other. So we're going to break you up into groups that are randomly assigned, and I'd like you all to talk just for about 3-4 minutes about this prompt. So what kind of vegetation along the field edge do you think would be best for increasing pest control by birds, and why? And feel free to talk about your individual experiences, observations, anything like that. All right. I think we've got everyone back now. So hopefully you guys were able to talk a little bit about this. Hopefully some people had some experiences to share. I'm not going to go over your answers too much right now, although at the end, if we have time, I would love to hear what some people were thinking. So moving on, basically, what's the answer to this question? This is kind of a trick question because the answer, like basically the answer to every question in biology is it depends, right? So I conducted a study in row crop farms in Northern California to try and answer this question. What I did was I went to 30 different farms and I placed caterpillar pests out on the farms on varying distances, at varying distances from the field edge. And some of these farms had hedgerows that were sort of shrubby growing along the edges of the farms. Some of them had tree lines, some had just grass or that was either mowed or weedy, and some of them had buildings or roads or things like that. So I placed these caterpillars out on the farms, and then I came back and observed where the caterpillars had actually been eaten by birds. So what I found was that along this horizontal axis, what we're looking at here is increasing distance to uncultivated habitat, meaning farther from the field edge. And then along this horizontal axis, what we're seeing is the probability that one of those caterpillars would have been consumed. So we see that as you get farther from the field edge, the probability of a pest being eaten decreased, but also that when you have shrubs as what's growing on the field margin, we're seeing a higher probability that these birds were consuming pests. And potentially these birds could be providing a very large service on these farms because up to 80% of these pest caterpillars that I placed out were actually consumed by birds. So in the case of these farms that were growing generally vegetables in Northern California, what I found was that having shrubby hedgerows was going to increase the probability of pest control services. But really, these results are going to depend on what type of bird you want to attract and what type of crop you're growing, right? So in this case, the crops that these farmers were growing were pretty low stature vegetables. And so having hedgerows along the edges of these fields was bringing in birds that would be more likely to forage in vegetable type crops. But let's say you have an orchard, for instance, you might find actually that having trees growing along the edge of your orchard is going to be better for attracting the type of birds that are used to foraging in trees for insect pests. So this is an example of a study that was done in apple orchards. And what they were looking at was, as you can see in this picture, the amount of woody vegetation or trees along the edge of the apple orchards. So here we can see in the middle, we've got this apple orchard and then a tree line here and here. So their results are shown here. What we're looking at here along the horizontal axis is an increasing proportion of woody vegetation. So basically at this far end, we're seeing more tree lines along the edge of the orchard and then fewer trees towards where it says 0. And what they found was that in these orchards with more trees, they were finding more insectivorous individual birds, as well as more species of insectivorous birds that were making use of the orchards. So in this situation, what we're finding is that having trees along the edges of these apple orchards was increasing bird activity in the orchards themselves. So I'm going to move on a little bit to the vegetation management surrounding the farms and how that affects pest control services. So in some areas that are totally dominated by either agriculture or development, you're really only going to get these larger, healthy bird communities where patches of natural habitat still exist. So for instance, this is a map of Illinois. That's where I'm based right now. And you can see everything in yellow is corn, everything in green is soybeans. It's really the majority of the state is cropped in these two types of crops. This is a map from 2016, but it basically looks the same now. So in this type of a landscape, you're really only going to get these bird communities in areas where we have these natural habitats. And for instance, around me, you sometimes have these either restored or remnant prairie patches. So I wanted to see if birds from these restored or remnant prairies, which were growing near cornfields, were providing an actual service on those cornfields. So I conducted this study on a cornfield that was near a prairie, and I placed cages over some of the corn crops to keep the birds off of the crops. And then I compared the crop yield with the some nearby plants that did not have cages, so they were accessible to birds. And what I found was in this field that was next to a natural prairie, we had a higher crop yield, so significantly higher crop yield in the corn plants that birds were able to access. And the exclosure crops, so the ones that birds could not get to, had a lower crop yield. So what we're seeing overall here is that these birds from this nearby grassland are providing a significant service in the corn agriculture that's nearby that grassland. And I was also interested in learning a little bit about how this was working. So what type of pests were these birds controlling? So I collected some fecal samples from birds that were foraging in the cornfield as well as in the nearby edge with that prairie. I did a DNA barcoding analysis, and what I found was that 34.5% of the birds that I tested had consumed this northern corn rootworm, which is a major pest of corn in this region. So likely what we were seeing was that birds from these nearby grasslands or prairies are providing a service in these otherwise, monocropped cornfields that is likely due to the fact that birds are eating this corn pest, this northern corn rootworm, and also some other species of pests that we detected as well. So another study that studied the effects of natural habitat on pest control took place in walnut orchards in California. And so what they found, what we're looking at here in this graph is increasing natural habitat in the surrounding landscape. We can just ignore, let's just look at these green bars for now. They also did a caged exclosure experiment. But focusing just on these green bars, we see that as the amount of natural landscape in the surrounding area around the farm increased, we saw a increased probability that birds were eating pests. Okay, so does increased natural habitat in the landscape always provide increased pest control services by birds? This is an example of a study that was trying to answer that by reviewing the scientific literature to try and look at that question. And what they found was that although it's not always the case that increased natural habitat in the landscape increases pest control services, that was the trend that they were seeing. All right, so just to conclude, a couple of things. Basically, what we're finding across the board is that increasing the diversity of vegetation, both on and around a farm, is going to help increase your pest control by birds. So specifically, we see that having more diverse crops within a farm can tend to give you more bird activity in those farms. Intercropping, so we had the example of the sunflowers that increased the insectivorous birds' activity in the farms. Having natural habitat along your field margins can also help to increase pest control. But again, it's going to depend what type of crop you're growing to determine what's going to be the best habitat to have. So if you've got lower growing vegetables or something like that, you might want to have shrubby field margins to help attract some of those birds that are going to eat pests in your vegetable fields. And then generally, although not always, we see that natural habitat, so increasing natural habitat in the landscape is going to give us increased pest control services by birds. All right, so thank you all for listening. I think we're going to move on to a slightly different topic now. Yeah, do you want to take it away?
Sure, I will. Yeah, why don't you stop sharing your screen and I'll start sharing mine. Cool. Just get this up and running. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Thank you so much, Megan, for that really great presentation. Thank you to the Wild Farm Alliance team for inviting me to be here. I'm Daniel Karp. I am an associate professor here at UC Davis. And so so far today, we've been hearing a lot about, some of the benefits of birds that you could try to bolster on your farm. You get these pest control benefits. But one of the major constraints that you guys as growers or in the ag industry might be facing is this concern that birds could be bringing on foodborne diseases onto your crop fields. You've probably heard about this in earlier presentations, but I want to think about that kind of concept of birds as vectors of foodborne diseases in the specific context of farm management. So if you're keeping habitat around your farm fields, is that going to recruit the birds, and is that going to carry food safety risks? So let's start off today with a little bit of a story of where a lot of these concerns came from. So you might remember back in 2006, there was this big E. coli outbreak, multi-state, that was traced back to bag spinach, and then it was traced specifically to California's central coast, where most of the leafy greens are grown for the US. And on one farm was this originating strain. It was found in the water and in the soil, but then also in the feces of cattle and wild pigs. And the pigs were the kicker, because it led industry to believe that wildlife were bringing these foodborne diseases onto farm fields. And therefore, growers should do everything that they could to keep wildlife away from their farm fields. So since that outbreak, farming practices has really changed in California and actually across the United States. So if you go to farm fields in California, you often see these rodent traps lining the edges. They could be filled with snap traps or anticoagulant rodenticides. You see wildlife fences. Most of the Salinas River is now fenced, as well as a lot of other areas in the region and elsewhere. And then the thing that we'll be talking a lot about today, we see a ton of vegetation removal. This idea that if you create a bare ground buffer around your farm fields, maybe the wildlife won't come onto those farm fields as much. And as a result, about 13% of the remaining riparian habitat was cleared along the Salinas River from 2005 to 2009. Numbers, other studies have kind of looked at this across the region and seen similar sorts of numbers. And a survey that we conducted back in 2015 of about 600 growers indicated that people were still clearing this habitat, decade after this outbreak had happened. And from conversations I have with growers, it's still happening today. So what I want us to do, we're going to do another breakout room. So get ready to interact a little bit. And what I want you to do is put on your kind of science thinking hat for a minute and try to brainstorm with each other in the room and think of any reasons why removing that habitat actually could be counterproductive for food safety. Is there any mechanism you can think of where having habitat around could actually be beneficial in preventing foodborne disease outbreaks? And if you can't come up with anything, that's totally fine. I just want to try to think of it from the reverse side of things. So I'm going to put you guys in rooms. You'll have a little bit to discuss, and then I would actually like to hear from one or two of you. So I'll ask some people to report back afterwards. So go on into your rooms and discuss why might it be that we could actually see the opposite of what growers would be intending, and habitat removal being bad for food safety? All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a minute to discuss this. I know we didn't have as much time as I would have liked in the breakout rooms for sure. Does anyone want to report back? Did anyone come up with anything? If you would like to share, just put on the raise hand function. I can unmute you guys, and then I'd love to hear from one or two of you. What did you guys come up with? Any ideas as to why it could be counterproductive to remove habitat? Or you could just disagree with me and say, no, it's definitely going to work. All right, Ed, why don't you go ahead? Oh, I'm trying to click ask to unmute. There you go.
So we came up with several thoughts. One is lack of habitat around the crop or area would mean there would be a different foraging area for wildlife. So it actually encouraged them to get into the crop. Secondly, based upon previous lectures, creating diversity around that crop could deter other potential pests. Like if you're creating habitat for raptors, keeping out problem pest birds. If you have a riparian habitat with more vegetation, that could potentially preclude a lot of waterfowl, and particularly with avian influenza going around right now, that could be a benefit. And then the fourth is just filtration. So particularly if you're near livestock operations, causing a reduction in potential E. coli and other waste going into the crop.
Great. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, you're doing my job for me, so I don't need to explain it. Those are great answers. Yeah, things that I often think about are things like the actual filtration potential of the vegetation, just like Ed said. Maybe we're concentrating these species to go forage in the crop if they don't have other habitats to forage in. And then more generally, we might just be promoting different species, right? We're never growing in a hospital-like condition where there's no species around. So it kind of matters which species are going to be on that farm. And so maybe in a field that has no habitat around, we would get different kinds of species, and those might be good or bad. So let's put our money where our mouth is and look at some data and see what it tells us. So to get at this question about whether habitat removal is actually making our food safer, I partnered with a large leafy greens organization and got my hands on about 240,000 tests of enterohemorrhagic E. coli, that's the kind of E. coli that gets you sick, and salmonella in leafy greens across 70 farms from the years 2007 to 2013. We also got a data set of generic E. coli, that's not the kind that necessarily gets you sick, in wells and waterways, about 7,000 tests across 480 farms. And then a smaller kind of academic scale data set of about 800 tests of salmonella in rodents on 9 farms. And the first thing that we wanted to do is simply look at the sort of spatial association between where this E. coli and salmonella is and then what's surrounding these farms. So we went out and characterized the vegetation around all these farm fields within 1.5 kilometers, noting, where was cropland, where was the grazed land with cattle or other types of grazers on it, riparian areas, and other types of natural habitats. And so what did we find? Well, we found that there were actually no significant effects of cropland, of riparian areas, or of other natural habitats on the frequency of detecting that E. coli in leafy greens. We did see a positive effect of grazable land. So if you had more grazed land around your farm field, it was more likely that you had a leafy green that tested positive. And that's not surprising. We know that E. coli, the pathogenic E. coli, came out of confined animal feedlot operations carried by cattle a lot. So, but we didn't see that effect of riparian or other natural habitats. And if we look at the effect of the ungrazed habitats on E. coli in water or salmonella in leafy greens or rodents, we also didn't see any significant effects there. But what's really cool about this data set was it's temporal. Remember, I told you we had data from 2007 all the way to 2013. So we could ask, for the farms that removed more habitat, what happened to the E. coli rates over time? And so that's what this is showing you right here. And if you kind of move to the left of this axis over here, you see a bigger decline in the change in natural habitat. So those are the farms that are removing lots of habitat. And you see, kind of counter to what you would expect from a farmer's perspective, that if you removed more habitat, actually, if anything, you're seeing a greater increase in E. coli over time. Now, you might think it's just driven by this one farm up here, but even if you remove it, it's still a significant trend. But even if you don't believe that, there is a lot of scatter here. Certainly, there's no stretch of the imagination that flips this into a positive line. And so we really, therefore, didn't see any evidence that habitat removal was beneficial. And if anything, it was increasing food safety risks. So then you might be thinking to yourself, all right, this is just one study. What do the other studies say? There's been studies in other regions kind of looking at this. Here are just 3 of them. One of them in 2013 by Laurie Strawn et al. Was looking at vegetated buffers in New York produce fields and found that having these vegetated buffers significantly reduced the likelihood of detecting salmonella. Another one more recently in 2021, Glaze et al. Showed that installing, this was an experiment where they installed vegetative buffers, and that reduced the transmission of salmonella and E. coli from animal operations to the produce farms in North Carolina. And yet another one that I think you've probably heard about earlier in this course by Sellers et al. In the Central Valley, they found that having hedgerows around farm fields did not increase rodent intrusion or pathogen prevalence in walnut orchards or tomato fields in California's Central Valley. So far, the body of evidence is not showing a connection between, habitat removal and making it more kind of safe from a kind of food safety pathogen perspective. But this class is supposed to be about birds, so you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about this in the absence of birds? So let's focus in on the role of birds in foodborne illnesses more generally. And indeed, growers are concerned about this. We've done interviews with growers, surveys with growers, and we get quotes like this one all the time. The thing that worries me more actually are birds. You can't control birds, and they're constantly flying over your field. They come and sit in the field, they carry salmonella. And so growers are concerned about them. And it might be that the habitat removal practice is simply just not discouraging bird intrusion, but they are indeed a risk, or they might not be a risk. So what do we need to be able to evaluate to see if birds are conferring food safety risks to fields? Well, the first thing that we need to know is, of the many species that visit farm fields, do they carry the pathogen in question? And if no, we don't need to worry about them. If they do, we need to worry about whether it's a human strain or not. Is it the actual strain of the bacteria that affects people? If not, then we don't need to worry about it. If it is, we need to know whether that bird is actually contacting the produce. Is it just spending time around the farm, maybe in the hedgerows or in adjacent habitat, but never actually going into the field? Or is it going into the field? And if it doesn't contact the produce, then we don't need to worry about it. If it does, then we need to think about this question about how changing the management, changing habitat amount would increase or not increase that likelihood of the bird contacting the produce. If that habitat does not increase the likelihood it contacts produce, then there's no extra risk of having that habitat around. If it does, then we need to ask ourselves another question, and that is, does the bacteria survive until, in the bird poop, until you would actually, consume that product or harvest that product? And if it doesn't survive that long in the bird poop, then we don't need to worry about it. But if it does, then we have to worry, and we have a higher risk of spillover. So thinking about this whole chain of events, I'm going to kind of narrow in on a couple parts of this chain, and we're going to look at two different studies today. We're going to look at a study of strawberry fields and of lettuce fields, 20 of each of them, surveyed for a variety of different things per year from the years 2018 to 2020 in the Central Coast of California, all right? And we really explicitly chose these farms so that they would vary in their characteristics, both in terms of their local diversity, so things like Megan was talking about whether they have hedgerows or flower strips or growing multiple crops, so things on the farm. And then also the characteristics of kind of around the farm, the broader landscape that she was talking about. So the amount of the ungrazed semi-natural habitat and then that grazed habitat that we know might have higher risks associated with them. So they're all varying in these characteristics. For the strawberry study, what we're doing is capturing birds with these mist nets and then collecting feces directly from them and testing them for foodborne pathogens. And then for the lettuce study, what we were doing was we were collecting feces from the lettuce. So going out there, looking on the lettuce, seeing if we can find any bird poop, and then collecting it and looking to see whether it's testing positive for pathogens, and then also doing bird counts to see which birds are around. So let's start off with this strawberry study. So the first thing to note is that bird feces only directly touched or contaminated 2 of the more than 10,000 strawberries we looked at. That said, we know that irrigation water can spread the kind of contaminants around, the pathogens around. So even if it's not directly touching, it still might be a risk. So what about the bird poop we collected from the birds? Well, foodborne pathogens were actually pretty rare. So S-Tech, that's the form of E. coli that gets you sick, was only found in 0.1% of birds. Salmonella was found in 0% of birds. And Campylobacter was found in 3.6% of birds, all right? But what's really interesting and sort of critical about the Campylobacter story is that as you increase the amount of that semi-natural habitat around farm field, you actually decrease the likelihood that any given bird was going to be testing positive for Campylobacter. The species that were the best hosts of Campylobacter were more likely to occur on those farms that had less habitat around them, less likely to carry Campylobacter on farms with more surrounding habitat, all right? What about the lettuce study? Let's look at that one. Well, of the 600 feces that we collected on lettuce plants, here we have 0% tested positive for the Shiga toxin producing E. coli, 0% tested positive for Salmonella, and about 5.7% tested positive for Campylobacter. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned about Campylobacter, but some is an interesting story, is that there's emerging evidence that suggests that the strains of Campylobacter that birds carry are actually pretty distinct from the type that gets us sick, and that Campylobacter is, a relatively common bacteria in birds, but it's just not the same one that really infects humans. So we wanted to do a subsequent analysis and look to see whether there were certain farm characteristics that would make for potential more food safety risk. But in creating this kind of metric of what we're calling potentially pathogenic feces, we're going to then look at Campylobacter, knowing that it might not be the strain that actually affects people. And then while no birds actually tested positive for the Shiga toxigenic E. coli, there was generic E. coli, which, we all have E. coli in our guts to some degree, but there was generic E. coli, and some of those E. coli had so-called virulence genes that allow that E. coli to bind to human cells. They didn't have that toxin producing that gets people sick, but we might bin that in and call something potentially pathogenic if it has any of these characteristics. So what we did then is we did some transects and noted the density of these feces that were potentially pathogenic, having any of these potential virulence genes or Campylobacter in them. And here what you see is how the density of that pathogenic feces changes as a function of local diversification, the amount of ungrazed semi-natural habitat, and the amount of grazed semi-natural habitat. And here you can see for the local diversification and the ungrazed, there were no significant trends, but for the grazed, we did see an increase. So if you have more grazed land around your farm field, again, you're at higher risk of having these higher densities of the pathogenic feces. So the grazed habitats carried higher food safety risk from birds, whereas the ungrazed habitats did not. So we might ask ourselves, what's driving these trends? Specifically, how are the bird communities changing across these different farm types? And so if we look at our bird surveys that we did here, one thing that we can look at is the local diversification and the number of birds we're seeing. And we see that we get slightly more species if we have more diversity on the farm field, if you have those hedgerows and other things that Megan was talking about. If we look at the identity of these birds, maybe we care about certain species that are declining of higher conservation concern, like this oak titmouse here, and maybe we care less about a species that has lower conservation value, like this invasive European starling here. You see that if you use the average sort of conservation value of all of these different birds that we were surveying, there's really no relationship with the local diversification. However, with the amount of ungrazed habitat around the farm field, we did see strong relationships. You get more species, and in particular, you get these species of higher conservation value. So we're getting these birds of higher conservation concern when you have more ungrazed habitat around the farm field. And one other really important thing from the food safety perspective to note is that those species of higher conservation concern, are less likely to form big flocks. And growers are really concerned about these big flocks of like blackbirds and starlings that we know are both more likely to carry foodborne pathogens and more likely to aggregate in large numbers and defecate in large amounts on the farm field. So the probability of actually observing a flock declined as you changed from a farm that didn't have much of this ungrazed semi-natural habitat around it to one that had a lot more around it. So these big flocks of birds are less likely on farms with more surrounding ungrazed habitats. So at least in the central coast of California, where we've been working for a long time and kind of studying the effects of habitat removal, what can we conclude? Well, as of now, we're finding that habitat removal does not improve food safety on fresh produce and might actually even increase pathogen prevalence, if anything. That habitat removal might favor those flock-forming species of higher risk and harm the species of higher conservation concern. So with that, I would like to acknowledge the kind of co-authors on all of this work, the amazing growers and landowners that we've worked with, the wonderful kind of funders we've had from the National Science Foundation and USDA, and then all of you guys for listening and participating. Hopefully we can have a little bit of time for questions now, and I can stop sharing my screen and take any questions. I'll let Brian handle that in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you so much to both Danny and Megan. So we have a couple minutes here, a bit more that we can do. So first, I know you did mention it, Danny, a little bit about the irrigation water, but there is a question about if there's any studies about that irrigation reservoir water quality, and also that relation with impacts from waterfowl.
Yeah, sure. So irrigation water quality is certainly a big issue, and there's been lots of studies showing that standing water is worse for food safety than like groundwater, well water type of things like that. And it can get contaminated, I think, through a variety of ways. There are some thoughts about whether birds could be bringing on foodborne diseases, water birds, into these standing water and contaminating that way. There's been like a couple of studies that I know of, one or two, but not much work that at all on that. So definitely an open area of research.
And there's a couple questions about grazing as well, but I did want to point out, thanks to Ursula, they mentioned this idea of comparing these, you're talking about foodborne safety risks, but how does that compare with maybe some of these toxins that are applied to these produce fields, such as pesticides, herbicides, and other sorts of things? Do those, create some threats to human health and safety versus these wildlife foodborne?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if it's like, well, there is actually a weird connection. There's one paper actually that's been studied to show that like applying more pesticides to farm fields decreases soil microbial diversity, and that microbial diversity is better at suppressing pathogens. So there is actually a connection between that and food safety. But I think that in some ways, they're just different human health issues that people would be concerned about. Certainly there are implications, especially for farm workers, that have been shown linked to pesticide applications. And yeah, we could have a whole nother discussion. I teach a conservation and working lands class, and we talk a lot about that kind of impact as well on human health. But that's also not to like negate the real and important concern about foodborne illnesses.
Right. So we'll just field a few more questions here. Hopefully, Shelley, if you want to put up kind of the last poll here. And I do apologize, Megan. All these questions are coming in related to grazing and a lot of the topics Danny was talking about. So to kind of wrap up, there's several questions here about grazing. Can you talk a little bit more about the actual grazing management practices themselves in these lands, right? Because there's a lot of diversity of grazing systems and practices. So are you talking about any grazing animals in these places, or is there a specific management technique associated with these practices?
Yeah, no, our resolution of knowledge here is super limited. We tried to get good maps of like, stocking densities and things like that to see if we could use that to get a better handle on what farms were at higher risk. And a lot of that stuff was really proprietary, and we just could not get our hands on those data. So we ended up using maps that were sort of combined from like grassland and then potential grazable land from the Cattlemen's Association. And so it's just the amount of this like likely grazed land by anything that we're using. So it's like pretty coarse. There have been studies showing that there are higher densities of foodborne pathogens in bird poop on farms that integrate livestock to some degree. So that there has been a study that showed that. But yeah, we, at least in our work, we haven't had any more resolution of saying like, okay, what density of cows, and is it cows versus is it sheep, or all that kind of stuff. I would love to get my hands on better data for that.
Wonderful, thank you. So folks, we are wrapping up here. So if you could fill out that final poll, that would be wonderful, because again, that allows us to improve the quality of our lessons and also report back to our program funders. So while you're doing that, are there any final takeaways, either Danny or Megan, that you would like to leave with folks today, and especially maybe things that they could chew on and reach out to us in the future?
So for my part, I think it's just So there's a question here, what other beneficial crops can you put in besides sunflowers? I think I just really want to emphasize the importance of having more structural diversity on your farm for attracting birds that are going to help with controlling pests. So for instance, in the example with the sunflowers, generally sunflowers are going to grow taller than some of the other crops. It's giving you some plants that are high and some that are low. A lot of birds really do like having that just height structural diversity. So you can introduce diversity to your fields in a variety of ways, like we talked about, with intercropping or with, the number of crops that you are growing. But really, it's about introducing that diversity and wherever possible, sort of adding, these natural elements that have some of that structural, height diversity to attract the birds.
Yeah, in terms of a parting thought, let me think about this. I guess thinking about habitat removal and food safety, I guess I'll just leave everyone with the idea that I think that this is a really thorny issue, and that a lot of the reason that there's a lot of habitat removal is because there's so much pressure on growers to remove habitat and they don't have a choice. A lot of that pressure comes from the kind of proprietary standards that are set by their buyers, which probably a lot of you guys know and are facing. And growers are just sort of caught in the middle. Even if they don't want to remove habitat, they have to if they're going to be able to sell their product. So something that we've been trying to do, largely unsuccessfully for years, is trying to get this information in the hands of the buyers and just show where the state of the science is. But to the extent that we can continue doing that, developing the science, getting it in the hands of the people that are going to be the leverage points for decision making, I think that's where we can move going forward. But the thing that I would like to end on then is just to say one more time that growers are in a really tough spot with a lot of this, and I totally empathize with the growers. As they really don't have a choice.
Wonderful. Thank you for both those nice final thoughts. And it's indeed the case, right, that the life of a farmer is not easy, never has been, and it continues to be more and more challenging. So hopefully through participating in this course that we're providing, we're trying to share that birds are not just something that you're going to tally and check off in your risk category when you're conducting risk assessments for your operations. And we encourage you to join us for our final 2 lessons, where we really start to just bring it all together and explore how we can start checking off all those benefits that birds can provide on your properties to try and balance out that weight of evidence that maybe there are some risks, which we must acknowledge, right? But that there's this whole large amount of benefits that wildlife and nature can provide to farmers. And that's really the optimistic and future that hopefully all of us share, especially here at Wild Farm Alliance and all of you joining us today. So again, thank you to our speakers, and that information for our next course can always be found on our website. And apologies if you were unable to answer some of those poll questions. We always send out an email following up after our lessons with further information. So again, thank you so much, Danny and Megan. Thank you all for participating today, and we hope that we can all live in a wild, more abundant future. Thank you very much.